Okay, so Groot in Marvel Rivals is completely insane. He's technically a vanguard, a tank, and he's capable of just dominating matches on his own if you know what to do with him. Seriously, if you play Groot, you can end up blocking 50 to 60k of damage, so you're taking that damage away from your team, but at the same time, you're getting as many eliminations as a full-on duelist DPS style character. And you can do all of this while having 1000 HP. It's absolutely crazy. And in this guide, I'm going to show you how to play Groot effectively, but I'm also going to tell you how you can beat him. He's absolutely amazing, but nobody is unbeatable in Marvel Rivals. Let's talk about Groot's playstyle first. He has a lot of unique elements, and there's a welcoming hectic style zen you get from him once you get into your flow. He is technically a vanguard tank, which means his primary duty is to soak up damage from the enemy team, which enables duelist DPS heroes to get easy eliminations, and also enables strategist support heroes to do their heals, to do their buffs. But due to his unique wall mechanics, Groot can be played as a hyper-aggressive damaging tank that absolutely leads the front line of his team, and while he's doing that, he's playing ahead of the objective and pushing the entire enemy team back. The pressure he can exert on the opposing team is absolutely staggering, and he uses his walls and abilities to basically be a vanguard and a duelist rolled into one character, so he's a bit of a hybrid in that regard. So what I'm saying is he takes a lot of damage and he gives a lot of damage back. It's awesome. You can also play Groot more defensively, so you can protect objectives, funnel the opposition into tight spaces with his walls, you can mix the two playstyles, and they're both completely valid, and in fact, you'll need to switch between them depending on what's going on in the match or what situation you're in. He can put up two different kinds of walls, and people usually tend to think of them as just a way to block damage, but there's so much more to them. Yeah, of course you can use Groot's walls to create choke points and elimination boxes, but it's only really lower skilled players that will kind of ignore taking them down and kind of be suppressed by them or just like dominated by them spatially or from a physical point of view. Higher skilled players know that these walls have secrets and they'll make it a priority to take them down, so you need to get clever with your walls and you need to be reactive with them. It's not one of those set and forget situations because you see, Groot has both damage dealing and healing walls. They're not just your typical tank walls that block projectile damage or something like that. So when you're playing as Groot, you almost want to think of his walls as reactive sentry turrets that you're constantly popping off and interacting with. You'll often find yourself putting down walls behind the enemy that is in front of you so that you can deal double damage to them with your normal attack and with your wall itself. And sometimes you'll use your healing wall to control physical space, but other times you'll pop it off beside you or behind you so that you're actively getting your health up and overhealing while you're ripping through the opposition that you're trapping with your offensive walls. You also have an ultimate attack that imprisons enemies and damages them and roots them to the spot, so you'll find yourself dropping it in tight team fights, or if you need to put a stop to a specific enemy that you're already walling or they're maybe going really hard against your team. Groot is an absolute menace, but he requires a few important traits to be played effectively. You need to develop great spatial awareness and game sense, you need to understand what's going on in the match, and kind of develop an instinct for when it's time to go backwards. So in order to do that, you have to keep an eye on the elimination feed, and you need to make sure you're always accounting for where most of the enemy team is. You also need good aim with Groot to maximize his potential, otherwise you'll just be a regular tank, which isn't terrible, but it's not anything special, Being a regular tank when you're playing as Groot doesn't really make a lot of sense. And of course, you'll also need to be able to use your walls in a way that doesn't destroy the effectiveness of your team. Your walls should be helping your team, not prevent your team from healing or doing damage or blocking their line of sight. In order to be effective in this regard, you'll need to play to your team's strengths and character types or heroes, and what good walls are for one team are not so good for another. Sometimes you'll just run into players that don't understand the walls as well, and they won't understand what you're even trying to accomplish. So in those situations, you'll be acting much more like a solo type duelist tank hero, whatever you want to call it. So there's a lot of versatility there and there's a lot of adaptability, and you always have to be changing things up based on the situation that you're in. And of course, like any other vanguard or tank in any video game ever, Groot needs a lot of healing in order to maximize his potential. We'll cover that point when we talk about how to beat him, but the main takeaway that I want you to have from this is you basically play Groot in a way where you use your walls as a resource, as a tool to damage and heal. You can also use them to block off areas, create choke points, but you're constantly putting up your walls, you're constantly manipulating enemies, you're constantly kind of sectioning them off from their own group, and when they are in a tight group, you can always pop off your ultimate while behind them, and you're just basically a menace. You're interrupting the game flow of the other team. It's great. Now let's talk about Groot's attack. So he has his Vine Strike normal attack, which looks like a melee attack, but it's actually considered a projectile. So it's blocked by anything that would normally block a projectile. There's a slight delay between attacks and there's no splash damage, so you'll really need to be reasonably accurate with them if you want them to be effective. You'll often be doing it at close range though, so aiming is pretty straightforward for Groot. And actually, I recommend not holding down the attack button for Groot unless the opposition is stuck or otherwise immobile, because the little delays on his attack combined with the need to be accurate means that if you hold down the attack button while whipping your crosshairs around, you'll end up in situations where you kind of feel like, oh, I should have hit someone, but actually if you go back, look at your footage, your timing was off, the attack interval was messing you up, or your aiming wasn't as clear as you wanted it to be. So I really recommend just point, click once, point, click once, point, click once. And this might feel a little bit awkward at first or annoying, but you'll get used to tapping very quickly. Groot also has a crowd control projectile called Spore Bomb, and I initially thought it was kind of lame and not so good, but I was very wrong about that the more I played with Groot. Basically, you throw down the projectile and it turns into a small cluster nade, damaging enemies around it. This is really useful to throw into crowds of opponents during team fights and get that extra damage on them, or after trapping your opponents with walls, or just to like finish off an opponent. The cooldown for these is about 6 seconds, so I like to use it liberally even if I don't have a real plan in that moment, because as a dominating tank, I know that if I'm constantly lowering the HP of my immediate opponents or their backline, it's more likely that my DPS or duelist heroes are going to quickly take them out. Now, of course, we have to talk about Groot's walls, but first you need to know about his passive ability that impacts those walls and maximizes their use. Groot has something called Flora Colossus, which awakens walls when he's somewhat near them. It's about 20 meters, and this passive is what unlocks the true potential of your walls and why Groot is so dang good when used aggressively or when creating tight choke points. His most common wall is called Thornlash, and it will damage opponents around it if it's awakened, so that means if Groot is nearby that wall. However, it's important to know that the Thornlash wall doesn't do this damage on its own. It's only when it's awakened, and it's only when Groot and allies are already damaging the opponents near it. So it's really important that Groot plays relatively close to his walls and that he uses them often, especially because Thornlash walls only have 250 HP. This means that they'll go down a lot and you'll rebuild them constantly. You can put down several walls at a time, and you can even reposition their angles to build exactly how you want to and make your own mega structures, but it's all point and click and very simple. It's not like those pro kids that you see at Fortnite pressing 95 buttons every 2 seconds in order to create the 8th wonder of the world. Anyway, Groot's second wall is called Ironwood, and it's big and has a lot of HP, but where it really shines is that it can overheal Groot. So you can use the Ironwood wall to control space because it's so big, or simply you can put it beside you or behind you because this bad boy gives you up to 250 bonus health over time. One thing you need to remember though is that the Ironwood healing wall functions like the other wall in the sense that the extra health that Groot is going to get comes from when that wall is awakened and when you're damaging opponents or your allies are damaging opponents near it. So you always have to remember, when you're Groot, you want to constantly cast and recast your walls, and you want to be relatively close to them. You don't have to play right exactly on the wall itself. You can be a little bit to the side or ahead or behind, but you need to play in the general vicinity of your walls. Now, of course, Groot is a tank, so he already starts with huge HP, but when you stack his healing Ironwood wall and a team-up boost from Rocket Raccoon or Jeff, your Groot can enter the 1000 HP territory. He's an absolute monster. Honestly, this makes Groot almost unstoppable. He can even tank a direct hit from Scarlet Witch's ultimate with that much health. And another great thing about Groot is his Strangling Prison ultimate ability. He throws down a projectile and it sucks in enemies near it, damages them, and roots them to the spot. So for a pretty generous amount of time, your opponents can't move when they're affected by this, and the ultimate ability here really shines in tight fights where you can immobilize many opponents at once, enabling your team to just blast them into oblivion. You can also use the Strangling Prison to deal with individual targets that maybe were difficult for your team to handle, and there's no shame in doing that. Ideally, you do more with it if you can, but if targeting one particularly good player is going to turn the tide of the match for you, then absolutely go for it. Okay, so if you made it this far, you might think I'm making it sound like Groot is an invincible god, but he's not. He has some dramatic weaknesses that you need to be able to play around. First of all, Blood here has absolutely no mobility. He's as slow as they come and strictly relies on his HP and healers to stay alive. If your team has bad healers that don't regularly heal tanks, Groot and pretty much any other tanks are not going to be able to do their thing. They won't be effective. Groot also can't really deal with air targets well, so peppering him from the sky is a great way to take down his HP. So if you're playing Groot as the hyper-aggressive tank carry that he is, it can sometimes be difficult to know what's going on with your back line. If your team isn't understanding what you're doing, there can be a big gap between you and the rest of them, which can be really easy to exploit with flanking characters. You'll find that you often want to look behind your shoulder to get a sense of what's going on. You want to pay attention to where the enemies are in general, and you really want to watch that elimination feed. So when you mix all these components together, basically you're putting yourself into 24/7 non-stop action. You're paying attention to so many different things while building and rebuilding walls, even moving walls, all while you're trying to do good damage and also take a lot of damage. Groot is a character that is execution heavy. You will be pressing many buttons, you will be doing many things. You have to earn that domination yourself. You really can't be idle as Groot or you'll be dead in the water. I think all of these weaknesses are perfectly normal. They balance the character well, and they don't take anything away from Groot being a great character. But if you're concerned about any of these weaknesses, if you're concerned about getting sniped, from a great distance or from the sky, or just about how you have to keep track of so many different things, then maybe Groot is not the character for you. Hey, by the way, I just want to tell you congratulations. Most people never make it this far in any YouTube video, but you made it almost to the end. So, if you enjoyed watching this or learned something new, please consider liking and subscribing, and let me know in the comments what you think of Groot. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.